Hi everyone, this is Andrew Prima, Ukrainian American, reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, week 178 of Russian full scale invasion of Ukraine, and this is the last week of July 2025. What measures could the US take against Russia to stop the war? This is what we're going to talk about today and why Putin is so confident and how to stop him. So, what measures could the US take against Russia? So, it seems like Trump loses his patience with Putin. This week, Trump announced that he would cut Russia's deadline to end hostilities from 50 to 10 days. There is no reason to delay, the American leader said. Speaking at the joint news conference with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer in Scotland, Trump also mentioned two measures he could take after the new deadline: additional sanctions against Russia and the imposition of massive tariffs on countries that buy Russian oil and gas. There are effective measures, but the key question the White House should ask itself is this: what actions are really capable of forcing Putin to accept the compromise peace that Trump advocated before taking office? Since the beginning of his revisionist course from the 2008 invasion of Georgia to the 2014 annexation of Crimea, the Russian president has managed to outwit and outlast Western opposition. Trump has the opportunity to change this dynamic. In order to do so, he must abandon the slow, piecemeal policies of the Biden administration and take decisive military and economic measures that will prevent Russia from making further gains on the battlefield and further reduce production in Russia's already struggling economy. What could this mean actually in practice? Providing Ukraine with offensive weapons. This is the answer. The Trump administration could make a good on its promise to provide Ukraine with modern weapons paid by European allies, as he stated before, including not just Patriot anti aircraft missile systems, but also offensive weapons that Ukraine doesn't have at the moment. If Trump is willing to go beyond the caution typical of the Biden team, he could announce his intention to provide Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles with a range of more than 1,000 miles if Russia's bombing of Ukraine cities and civilians doesn't stop within the next 10 days. This could prompt Germany to do the same, providing its Taurus missiles, which allies discussed with Germany already over a year. The United States could also quickly conclude an agreement with Ukraine to jointly produce advanced drones. This would strengthen defense capabilities of both Ukraine and the United States, which is a win win situation. With these and other weapons, Ukraine could be able to threaten Russian supply lines in Crimea and key logistical points that support the front in eastern Ukraine, which is an important step in deterring the Russian offensive and creating incentives for the ceasefire. Another point: the NATO should be strengthened. The Trump administration could build on the success of the recent NATO summit in The Hague in strengthening allies' deterrent capabilities. The recent deployment of nuclear weapons to the UK was a significant step in this direction. The next logical step would be to formally declare that any Russian missile or drones flying through NATO airspace en route to Ukraine would be treated as hostile and would be immediately destroyed. Another point: strengthening sanctions and tariffs. On July 14 and 28, Trump reiterated his intention to impose secondary tariffs on Russia's trading partners, primarily China and India, the largest buyers of Russian hydrocarbons, if Putin didn't agree to ceasefire. There is considerable momentum in the US Congress for the tough bill combining sanctions and secondary tariffs initiated by Senator Lindsey Graham. The reality, however, is that, as Trump has shown elsewhere, he is quite capable of unilaterally increasing tariff on his own. With Moscow's otherwise weakened economy, heavily supported by Beijing and New Delhi's purchases of its gas and oil, the threat of large scale tariffs could significantly weaken the Russian economy's ability to finance the ongoing aggression in Ukraine. Given the recent seizure of Russian drone, largely assembled from Chinese components, on the battlefield in Ukraine, the US could impose sanctions on China for violating the arms embargo. In addition to tariffs and sanctions, the US could also advocate for increased international cooperation to stop the shadow fleet transporting smuggled Russian oil. Another point, pressure on Europe on frozen to pressure Europe on frozen Russian assets. Putin is convinced that he can wait out both the military and economic aid to Ukraine and the political support from the West. One effective way to provide him otherwise is ensure that Ukraine transfers almost 300 billion frozen Russian state assets. In recent weeks, Trump has proven himself to be a tough but effective negotiator with European partners. He could once again press Europe to take real steps in supporting Ukraine. Even just transferring these assets to Ukraine, most of which are held in European financial institutions, would ensure sustainable financing of the country's defense and economic needs for more than 3 years to come. A comprehensive and rapid application of all or most of the above measures could deal a serious blow to Putin's confidence that time is on his side. This is the best opportunity to persuade the Russian president to negotiate a long term peace settlement. As Trump himself put it, there is no reason to wait. At the same time, Kremlin is confidently bluffing and exaggerates its global role and power. And they think they can keep on tricking the West and fooling the US leader by continuing the war. In the past week, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev and right hand of Putin engaged in a verbal clash with Donald Trump, received a response from the US president, and replied again. You can see actually how quickly the mood in Russia shifts from calling America a damned country to moments of love when Trump, influenced by certain circumstances, suddenly started to give passes to Putin. So remember that Trump's initial proposal to Ukraine seems to mirror Moscow's wishes. And up to today's point, when Trump is again seen as embodiment of evil, America is described as the worst country on the earth. And what are America and Russia? Let's take a look at them from economic standpoint. So, the US accounts for 25% of the world's GDP, while Russia is around only 1.2 or sometimes at the most 1.5% of the global GDP. What does this competition between the countries mean? The fact that in Russia they keep living in a parallel reality and puff out their cheeks. They think that by threatening the rest of the world with nuclear weapons, they will stay afloat. But this will not happen for long. Look, the Russian economy is under huge influence of China. By the way, this is the term used in Russia when they talk about the Chineseification of the automobile industry in Russia. This is translating from this newspeak. We must simply say that Russia's automobile industry has ceased to exist because it has been replaced by the Chinese one. Not in the sense that the Chinese company invested in the Russian automobile industry, but in the sense that they simply killed the Russian automobile industry, imported their goods, and now the Russian automobile industry cannot physically function. And even what China says, they say we do not want Russia to lose, is for the time being, because it's objectively losing. It has no resources, it is already exhausting them to the last strength. Even by the Russians' own calculations, they now have a deficit that was planned for the entire year. And since the pace is not slowing down, it will be twice as large as expected, reaching 8 trillion rubles, twice as much as expected. This indicates a one way path. I believe that when all these internal and external factors align, something will happen in the very short term that could lead to the collapse of the economic system of Russia. This is when one region, and essentially its elite, thinks I'm now producing 100 billion worth of goods, oil, gas, diamonds, rare earth metals, and so on. But what do I get from Moscow? Poverty. In other words, I'm a typical colony. When the situation reaches a point where economic activity in Russia ceases and everything is going well before that, each region, elite, even Russian-speaking ones, including those they consider their own, and I'm not talking about the national regions, will start building internal barriers. This means that to sell their goods to a neighboring region, they will have to pay duties and other costs. This is the first and also the last step toward internal disintegration. It will be followed by political disintegration, leading to the regime's fall. That's essentially how this is how the economists and experts see the future of Russia in the next couple of years. And if Trump now assists with his strong economic measures and finally realizes that Putin is not just fooling him, then this process will be accelerated. I think that after the terrible shelling of Kiev in July 31st, when Russia killed 31 people in one night attack, Trump will not wait until August 8th. What happened once again showed that we are dealing with wild barbarians and barbarism must be responded to harshly. I believe Trump's patience may be running out. So let's see. So, two things need to happen at the moment: very tough economic sanctions and very accelerated military aid to Ukraine. These two steps will be key to shifting the situation both on the battlefield and inside Russia in Ukraine's favor. So, the most immediate reason Putin refuses to end the war in Ukraine is that he sees himself as the winner. The Russian army is advancing along various sections of the front line, while the Ukrainian armed forces are methodically losing strength. Although process has been exceptionally slow, there is no doubt that Putin currently holds the initiative on the battlefield and can reasonably expect to win a war of attrition against a much weaker enemy. Putin is also encouraged by the limited international support available to Ukraine. While Kiev's partners have provided substantial military and financial assistance, this assistance has been consistently delayed or curtailed, curtailed due to domestic political consideration and widespread Western fears of potential escalation by Russia. With Putin's army taking over more and more territory and his opponents so easily intimidated, it's easy to see why the Russian leader would prefer to continue the invasion, waiting for what he believes is the inevitable collapse of Ukraine. On the domestic front, Putin has a number of additional practical reasons to prefer the harsh realities of war to the unpredictability of the world. Since 2022, he has managed to put the Russian economy on the war footing. At the same time, massive increases in military spending and soldiers' pay have helped offset the damage done by international sanctions. Russian factories are now operating around the clock and producing more weapons than all NATO members combined. As a result of the shift to a war economy, Military of ordinary Russian families are doing much better than they did in 2022. At the same time, the results of this transition have been highly uneven. The flood of state subsidies into the Russian economy has led to a sharp rise in inflation and forced the Kremlin to sharply raise interest rates, which has hurt many non military companies that make up the bulk of the real Russian economy. In addition to the defense sector, Russian oil and gas exports have been redirected to new markets in the global south. Meanwhile, Western companies that left Russia in response to the war have been replaced by local alternatives, creating ample opportunities for the enrichment of many members of Putin's inner circle. A ceasefire would jeopardize this entire economic model with potentially destabilizing consequences for the country as a whole. The full scale invasion of Ukraine has brought similar political dividends to the Putin regime. Since 2022, the Kremlin has been using wartime conditions to complete Russia's long post-Soviet transition from the flawed democracy to dictatorship. Virtually all potential opponents of the regime are now in exile, in prison, or simply dead. The last vestiges of independent media have been destroyed, and civil liberties have been further curtailed. There is no significant anti war movement in modern Russia at all, nor is there any serious doubts that that Putin will remain in power until the end of his current term in 2036, if he lives to do so. If Trump and other leaders want really to change the Kremlin's calculations and convince Putin to end the war, they should learn from the past 6 months. It is clear that the military situation on the ground needs to change and Putin needs to question his confidence in Russia's victory. This means providing Ukraine with weapons capable of defending its cities from bombing, regaining the initiative on the battlefield, and bringing the war to Russian soil. The West has all the tools it needs to do this. The only thing missing is the political will. Anything less will only prolong the war and encourage Putin to escalate further. It's clear that additional sanctions are needed to undermine Russia's robust military economy and to convince the dictator that continuing the invasion will ultimately bankrupt his country. This will require much tougher measures against Russia's energy exports, as well as secondary sanctions on countries that help Moscow circumvent the current sanctions. In parallel, the numerous European countries that continue to trade with the Kremlin must receive a clear signal that such practices will no longer be perceived as acceptable. First, Western leaders must force dictator Putin to abandon his imperial ambitions and finally accept the irreversible historical reality of an independent Ukraine. This will require far greater determination than anything the West has demonstrated since 2022, but it is the only way to ensure a lasting peace. Putin's anti Ukrainian crusade has defined his entire reign, reflecting his burning desire to overturn the 1991 verdict and revive the Russian Empire. He has staked everything on destroying Ukraine's independence and is prepared to do almost anything to achieve this criminal goal. Therefore, from Putin's perspective, the stakes could not be higher, and the benefits of continuing the war now far outweigh its cost. The situation will change only if he is faced with the threat of military defeat in Ukraine and the very real prospect of a new Russian national collapse. Thank you for listening. If you like my podcast, share with your friends.